The village of Little Wimbrel was one of those places that seemed impervious to time, a quiet hamlet where the rhythm of life was dictated by the church bells, the gossip of shopkeepers, and the slow passage of seasons. Spring was at its height, and the gardens of Little Wimbrel had taken on a delicate bloom, the kind that invited leisurely strolls and casual conversations. It was the day of Mrs. Arabella Winslow's annual garden party, an event that villagers regarded as a social fixture with a mixture of anticipation and mild dread. Miss Marple, knitting in the shade of her ivy-draped veranda, observed the preparations with quiet amusement. She had long since learned that the grandeur of these gatherings often concealed more than it revealed. The Winslow estate, perched on the gentle rise overlooking the village, had earned a reputation not just for its manicured lawns, but for its hostesses' formidable social skills. Mrs. Winslow's talent lay in knowing precisely which guests would clash, which would gossip, and which would simply fade into polite obscurity. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called a voice from below. It was young Margaret Pritchard, who often ran errands for the elder villagers. "Mrs. Winslow says she hopes you'll come, though she knows you prefer your own company." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her hat. "I shall be along presently, dear. One mustn't miss the spectacle, after all." She had arrived at the party more out of curiosity than pleasure. She had attended enough of Mrs. Winslow's gatherings to know that beneath the lace and lavender, small villages hid tempers sharper than any city dagger. Observing those tempers had often proved more enlightening than idle conversation. By mid-morning, the Winslow gardens were awash with color and activity. Guests strolled along the winding paths, clutching iced tea and perfumed handkerchiefs. Children ran along the lawns, squealing with delight, and the soft chime of the estate's bell tower punctuated the murmur of polite chatter. It was, on the surface, an idyllic tableau, the kind of scene painted in postcards or the glossy pages of a country magazine. Yet, even as Miss Marple approached the gathering, she could sense a subtle undercurrent of tension. A gentleman in a grey suit, who introduced himself as Mr. Edward Haythorne, seemed overly attentive to the placement of his hat and the angle of his bow tie. Across the garden, Mrs. Penelope Sayers, well known for her sharp tongue and precise social maneuverings, whispered something to the vicar, a smile curving her lips in a way that suggested delight at some private joke. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath the rim of her hat, noted these small oddities. There was, as always, a story behind every polite smile, every subtle frown. She often reflected that human nature, when observed closely, was rarely kind or straightforward. The party reached its peak as Mrs. Winslow, dressed in a pale blue, gown trimmed with lace, announced that the prize for the best horticultural arrangement would be awarded shortly. Conversations became punctuated by gentle applause, occasional laughter, and the distant echo of the bell tower ringing the hour. Miss Marple, however, found herself more engrossed in the subtle interplay among the guests than in the floral competition. She noticed, for instance, that Mr. Haythorne lingered near the prize table far longer than necessary, his gaze darting frequently toward a corner of the garden where a small group of villagers had gathered. Nearby, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Agnes Cartwright, adjusted her gloves nervously, speaking in hushed tones to her friend Mrs. Bellamy. "Did you hear about the accident at the mill last week?" "Quite dreadful," she whispered, though her eyes continually flicked toward the bell tower. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, noting the unease. Accidents in Little Wimbrel were rare. Tragedies rarer still. Yet the conversation hinted at a story that had already begun to shape itself among the villagers' collective imagination. Just as the flower arrangements were being examined, a sharp cry shattered the measured rhythm of the party. Guests turned in alarm to see Mrs. Winslow herself, pale and trembling, standing at the foot of the bell tower steps. Her hands clutched a handkerchief to her lips, and her eyes were wide with horror. "It's Mrs. Davenport," she exclaimed, her voice quivering. "Up by the bell tower. She's fallen." A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire. Mrs. Marjorie Davenport, the widow who lived alone in the house adjoining the churchyard, was known for her solitary walks and quiet manners. She was in her late 60s, with a thin frame and eyes that seemed to see too much of the world. The villagers had always regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She had no family, no close friends, and a reputation for keeping her affairs strictly private. Guests surged toward the bell tower, some clutching parasols, others fumbling for their hats, all voices overlapping in a confused chorus. Miss Marple, however, took her time, knitting needles still poised in her lap, her mind already cataloguing the details. A fall from the tower could be accidental, of course, but human nature, she reflected, sometimes had a habit of disguising darker truths beneath appearances of happenstance. By the time she reached the base of the tower, the village doctor had arrived, and the first tentative attempts to ascertain the widow's condition were underway. A few villagers whispered, speculating on the cause. A sudden faint, a misstep, perhaps even something more sinister. Miss Marple observed silently, noting the tension that rippled through the crowd, the subtle glances exchanged, the fleeting expressions of fear or guilt. She did not speak at first. She simply watched, letting the scene unfold like the careful turning of a page in one of her beloved mystery novels. The villagers were quick to form theories, as they always were, and yet she sensed that the true story was hidden somewhere beneath the surface, in a look, a gesture, or a tiny, overlooked detail that would reveal itself only to one who had learned the art of careful observation. For Miss Marple, the day's tranquility had been irrevocably broken, and while the villagers might see only a tragic accident at the bell tower, she knew, intuitively, that what seemed like misfortune might, in fact, be something far more deliberate. By the following morning, Little Wimbrel was no longer the tranquil village it had been the day before. The news of Mrs. Marjorie Davenport's fall at the bell tower had travelled faster than the morning mist over the fields, carried along by the nimble tongues of shopkeepers, postmen, and women who gathered daily by their doorsteps. In a place where everyone knew, or thought they knew, everyone else's business, gossip had become the lifeblood of conversation. Miss Marple, walking along the narrow cobbled streets, noted the familiar faces and their subtly altered expressions. There was Mr. Haythorne, frowning as he conversed with the baker, his eyes occasionally darting toward the churchyard. Mrs. Penelope Sayers lingered near the general store, offering pointed remarks to anyone who would listen, her lips curving in a perpetual half-smile that suggested delight at others' misfortune. Even the vicar, normally the picture of calm, seemed slightly distracted, pausing in his usual rounds to murmur quietly to the curate. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a peculiar state of affairs. The village, which had always thrived on routine, now pulsed with whispered theories, half-formed suspicions, and sudden insights that were, more often than not, wrong. People could not resist speculation. It was the way they understood the world, and when the explanation was unpleasant, perhaps even criminal, there was a certain perverse satisfaction in imagining oneself as a detective. At the corner of Church Lane, Mrs. Agnes Cartwright and Mrs. Bellamy were engaged in precisely this activity. "It's terribly suspicious," Mrs. Cartwright whispered, lowering her voice so that only her companion could hear. Mrs. Davenport was careful, always cautious. How could she have simply fallen? Mrs. Bellamy nodded vigorously, clutching a small basket of eggs. "Exactly. And think of the bell tower itself. So high, so dangerous. One misstep and, oh, it's simply frightening to imagine. Perhaps someone unkind, pushed her." Miss Marple, walking slowly past them, pretended not to hear, though she made a mental note of their theory. The idea of someone being pushed, while dramatic, was one of the most common explanations in cases of accidental falls, or apparent accidents. She would not dismiss it outright, but her experience told her to watch carefully, for the truth was usually subtler than the gossip suggested. Inside the village shop, the postmaster, Mr. Finch, was eagerly recounting the incident to any customer who paused long enough to listen. "I saw it myself, or nearly," he declared, adjusting his spectacles. "She was standing by the tower, chatting with no one in particular, and then, I don't know what happened. Just down she went, like an autumn leaf." Behind the counter, a young clerk added, "I heard Mrs. Winslow say something about a quarrel last week, between Mrs. Davenport and the new school teacher, Miss Havisham, or someone like that. You know how these things go. Small towns, tempers flare." Miss Marple, lingering near the counter to purchase a loaf of bread, observed the interaction with her characteristic patience. She was aware of the way people's minds worked when scandal touched their lives. It did not matter whether a statement was true. The mere suggestion of conflict provided fertile ground for imagination. Outside, children whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances toward the bell tower. "Do you think she tripped?" asked little Peter Tewksbury, tugging at his sister's hand. "Or did someone push her?" "Shh," his sister replied, equally serious. "You'll jinx it." Even the village constable, Constable Briggs, was caught in the tide of rumor. He had arrived at the scene promptly, but found himself distracted by the persistent questions of neighbors who seemed eager to supply the facts, or their versions of them. "It's likely nothing more than an accident," he muttered repeatedly, though his tight-lipped expression suggested uncertainty. He was accustomed to minor thefts and occasional drunken disputes, not the complexities of potential murder or deliberate harm. Miss Marple, from the corner of her eye, watched the constable carefully. She noted the slight frown, the hesitant movements, and the manner in which he repeated what he had already said, almost as if hoping the words themselves would render the situation less troubling. It was a behavior she recognized well, fear masquerading as reassurance. By mid-morning, the village had divided itself into informal camps of opinion. There were those who clung to the theory of accident, citing Mrs. Davenport's age and the uneven stones at the tower's base. Others insisted on malice, imagining secret quarrels, jealousies, and long-buried resentments. And then there were those, like Miss Marple, who observed quietly, aware that human nature often presented more clues than direct evidence ever could. The postman, delivering letters with his usual efficiency, paused near the churchyard and remarked to a small cluster of villagers, "I wonder if it was really an accident, or if some old rivalry is at play. You never know with the Davenports. They have their own way of settling scores." Miss Marple, hearing this, only smiled slightly. The widow, in her quiet, solitary manner, had few acquaintances who might wish her harm. Yet the subtleties of personal resentment were never so easily mapped. A neighbor's kindness could mask years of envy or irritation, and what appeared trivial might be enough to tip a delicate balance toward disaster. By lunchtime, a palpable tension had settled over Little Whimbrel. Tea gatherings in neighboring houses were subdued. Conversation, when it occurred, was interrupted by sudden exclamations of, "Did you hear?" or "They say." Each visitor, whether village resident or occasional guest, seemed driven by the desire to construct a narrative that made sense of the inexplicable fall at the bell tower. Miss Marple, returning to her own small cottage, reflected on the chaos of rumor and the fragility of appearances. She understood that the village's reaction, while predictable, would complicate any attempt to discern the truth. In Little Whimbrel, as in all communities, the smallest detail overlooked, the subtlest shift in expression, could be the key to unraveling a mystery that outwardly appeared simple. As she settled in with her knitting, Miss Marple's sharp eyes surveyed the scene once more. Somewhere, amidst the whispers, half-truths and conjectures, the real story lay hidden, and she would, in due course, find it, not through force or authority, but through the quiet observation of human nature, the intricate patterns of behavior that no amount of gossip could fully conceal. Miss Marple awoke the morning following Mrs. Davenport's fall with a quiet sense of purpose. The village had already begun its usual cycle of speculation, but she knew better than to rely on words alone. Facts, even in the most ordinary of settings, often revealed themselves in behavior rather than speech. And little Wimbrel, with its narrow streets, shaded gardens, and clusters of watchful faces, offered no shortage of subtle indicators for those who had the patience to notice them. After breakfast, she set off toward the Winslow estate, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Davenport's condition, but in truth to observe. The gardens, already familiar from the previous day's party, now carried a different energy. The tension of suspicion hung in the air like mist over the fields. Guests from the party had dispersed, yet small groups lingered along paths and benches, their eyes darting toward the bell tower, their voices reduced to murmurs when approached. Miss Marple's first stop was the vicarage. The vicar himself greeted her at the door, hands folded in that manner of polite restraint habitual to clergymen confronted with minor tragedies. "I trust you are well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but touched with a subtle anxiety. "The widow is resting, though her condition is delicate." "I am concerned," Miss Marple replied in her gentle, almost casual tone. "Falling from such a height can be frightening for anyone, even the most cautious, but I cannot help thinking there is more to observe than merely the physical consequences." The vicar inclined his head, a faint frown crossing his features. "Naturally, of course. You have a keen eye, as always. The villagers are unsettled. They seem eager to supply explanations before the facts are known." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and it is often in those explanations, rather than the facts, that one can discern the truth." Her attention was drawn first to the small garden gate, slightly ajar. A visitor might consider it inconsequential, yet Miss Marple noted the faint scuff marks on the ground and a subtle smudge on the latch. Someone had opened it recently, and perhaps in haste. It was a detail that the villagers would overlook entirely, preoccupied with more dramatic theories. But to Miss Marple, it suggested movement, presence, and a sequence of events that might otherwise remain invisible. She walked onward, taking the path toward the bell tower itself. The stones were uneven, worn by decades of footsteps, but nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Yet Miss Marple's trained eye detected a tiny fragment of fabric caught on one of the lower protrusions, a thread of deep violet, almost imperceptible unless one was looking deliberately. She bent slightly to examine it, noting the careful stitching. It was a material not commonly worn in the village, not in the modest attire of most villagers. A small, seemingly insignificant clue, but one that suggested proximity at the critical moment. As she straightened, she saw Mrs. Penelope Sayers approaching along the garden path. Her expression was composed, but carried the faint tension of someone eager to assert opinion. "Miss Marple," she began, voice smooth. "Such a dreadful affair, isn't it? I dare say accidents do happen, though one might suspect that a certain neglect played a role. One must be careful whom one trusts, even in little Wimbrel." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, observing Mrs. Sayers as she spoke. There was precision in her words, a careful selection designed to imply knowledge without offering evidence. Miss Marple filed this away, noting that Mrs. Sayers's fascination with conjecture often concealed a sharper interest in influence, the subtle assertion of moral authority over her neighbors. A few steps further, Miss Marple encountered the village doctor, Dr. Faraday, who had been attending Mrs. Davenport since the incident. He offered a thin smile, but avoided eye contact, as though hesitant to meet scrutiny directly. "She is stable for now," he said, nodding toward the tower. "It may have been nothing more than a misstep, but we shall see. Such falls can be deceptive. One never knows the underlying complications." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, watching the doctor closely. He seemed troubled, not by professional concern alone, but by the knowledge that others would immediately ascribe blame. His own demeanor suggested an awareness of the subtle dangers of village gossip, the way a single comment could shape opinion as effectively as any evidence. Miss Marple's attention then turned to the small crowd lingering near the foot of the tower. Villagers had begun to return gradually, drawn by curiosity or a sense of duty. Children peered around corners of hedges, whispering excitedly, while adults speculated in hushed tones. She noticed Mr. Edward Haythorne among them, standing apart, yet observing with particular intensity. His expression, caught between anxiety and calculation, suggested preoccupation with more than idle interest. As she passed, Mr. Haythorne gave a polite nod, though his eyes remained alert, scanning the immediate surroundings. Miss Marple's mind catalogued these movements, vigilance that might indicate fear, calculation, or knowledge, sometimes all three simultaneously. Further observation revealed another detail easily overlooked: footprints near the base of the tower that diverged subtly from the main path. Some were unmistakably fresh, others older, worn into the dirt over time. Miss Marple crouched, following the trajectory. The angle of entry suggested more than casual passage. Whoever had been present during the incident had moved deliberately, yet without obvious signs of haste or panic. The implication was subtle. Someone had been cautious, possibly even rehearsing the actions that led to the widow's fall, or the scene as it appeared afterward. Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze sweeping over the tower itself, its time-worn stones silent and immovable. To the untrained eye, it was simply a structure, a bell tower standing as it had for decades. But Miss Marple saw it differently, as a stage upon which human motives played themselves out, a structure around which fear, envy, and prudence had coalesced. Every person who approached it had left traces, physical, behavioral, and emotional, that, if interpreted carefully, would reveal the truth. By mid-morning, she returned home, her mind actively piecing together the puzzle. Patterns were forming, though still incomplete. Subtle tensions, half-spoken observations, and minor discrepancies in movement suggested more than accident. She considered each villager's reactions, their gestures, and their attentiveness to one another. Each had contributed, knowingly or not, to a tableau that masked the incident's true nature. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside, her sharp eyes fixed on the faint morning sunlight dancing across her table. Observation, reflection, and patience would be her tools. She knew that in Little Wimbrel, as elsewhere, the truth often rested not in grand revelations, but in the quiet, almost invisible details of human behavior, and she was determined to uncover them, one small clue at a time. By the afternoon following Mrs. Davenport's fall, the mood in Little Wimbrel had grown increasingly tense. The initial shock had given way to a mixture of speculation, anxiety, and, in certain quarters, indignation. Gossip flowed with renewed energy, each version of events more imaginative than the last. For those with a penchant for drama, the village had become a theatre, and Mrs. Davenport's fall a tragedy whose authorship begged discovery. Miss Marple, ever patient and understated, moved through the village deliberately, observing without intrusion. Her keen eyes, trained for decades in the subtle art of human observation, noticed the first cracks in behavior that might otherwise have gone unseen. Among the villagers, certain individuals were now appearing in patterns she recognized. Those eager to assert innocence, those overly anxious to judge, and those whose movements betrayed attention to detail beyond mere curiosity. Her first stop was the small tea shop on Church Lane, where several of the villagers had gathered. Mr. Edward Haythorne, the young gentleman whose presence had drawn attention during the garden party, was seated stiffly at a corner table. He drank his tea with meticulous care, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the window and then toward the bell tower itself. "It seems a most unfortunate accident," said Mrs. Penelope Sayers, seated opposite him, voice smooth and tinged with judgment. "Of course, we must consider the possibility of carelessness, though I suspect there is more to this than meets the eye." Haythorn's brow furrowed, and he glanced at her sharply. "I assure you, Mrs. Sayers, I have no knowledge of any wrongdoing. It is entirely possible that the lady simply lost her balance." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively at a side table, listened quietly. She noted the faint tension in Haythorn's hands as he adjusted his cup, the way his gaze wandered repeatedly. A man with nothing to hide, she reflected, rarely allowed his attention to flicker in such ways. Yet she withheld judgment. Appearances, after all, were seldom definitive. Nearby, Mrs. Bellamy whispered to Mrs. Cartwright, eyes darting toward the pair. "I hear the schoolteacher was involved," she murmured. "Miss Havisham, you know. She has a sharp tongue. Perhaps there was some argument we were unaware of." Miss Marple's ears twitched slightly at the mention of Miss Havisham. The young teacher had arrived in the village only a few months prior, carrying with her the airs of efficiency and modern thought that occasionally clashed with the villagers' more traditional inclinations. She was known for her stern discipline and keen intelligence, traits that might inspire both admiration and resentment. From the corner of the tea shop, the postman, Mr. Finch, leaned toward the group with a conspiratorial air. "I saw her talking to someone near the bell tower the day before," he confided. "I cannot say who exactly, but there was a discussion. Perhaps it led to this accident." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Observing behavior was more revealing than chasing conjecture. Who lingered near the east tower? Who appeared overly concerned or too casual? She made mental notes. Haythorn's vigilance, Miss Havisham's disciplined presence, and the slightly too eager gossip of the postman himself. Later, she visited the Davenport household. The widow's condition, while physically stable, had left her in a state of mild shock. Mrs. Davenport's speech was careful, precise, revealing little beyond her immediate distress. Yet her eyes flickered with the knowledge that something beyond mere misfortune had occurred, a hint that did not escape Miss Marple. She did not see it coming, Miss Marple observed gently, as if speaking to herself more than to anyone else. Yet there was movement around her, subtle and calculated. It is difficult to say whether it was human intention or mere circumstance. Mrs. Davenport looked at her with a faint, grateful smile. "I cannot imagine who would wish me harm," she murmured. "I have no enemies, or so I thought." Miss Marple inclined her head. She had long since learned that even the most solitary of individuals often carried the weight of small grievances, imagined slights, or misinterpreted gestures. The key, she reflected, lay not in assuming malevolence, but in discerning patterns in behavior. By mid-afternoon, the local constable had attempted a more formal inquiry. Constable Briggs gathered those closest to the bell tower the day of the fall, asking questions that were polite but perfunctory. He focused on proximity and timing, hoping to determine a simple cause. Yet it was Miss Marple who observed the interactions. She noticed the subtle shifts, Haythorn's quick adjustment of his cuff, Miss Havisham's barely perceptible hesitation before answering a question, Mrs. Sayers's calculated distance from the group, and even the postman's slightly over-eager insistence that he had nothing to hide. It was these minute, almost imperceptible behaviors that suggested to Miss Marple a more complex web of relationships than outward appearances allowed. The villagers' reactions were layered: fear, guilt, curiosity, and the occasional desire for attention or recognition. Each offered a potential clue, a thread that, if followed with care, might reveal the underlying truth. By evening, speculation had solidified into informal theories. One group insisted it was merely a tragic accident, citing the uneven stones and the widow's solitary nature. Another whispered of a quarrel, of jealousy, or of resentment festering unseen. And a third, smaller group, those who observed quietly rather than spoke, simply waited, knowing that the truth often revealed itself in silence. Miss Marple returned home, reflecting on the day's observations. She considered each person she had seen, noting behaviors that aligned with innocence, subtle indications that hinted at culpability, and patterns that might explain both the incident and the villagers' responses. By the time dusk settled over Little Wimbrel, the first suspects had emerged in the collective imagination of the villagers. Mr. Edward Haythorne, whose attentiveness seemed almost unnatural; Miss Havisham, whose sharp temperament had made her a target of idle speculation; and indirectly, Mrs. Penelope Sayers, whose fascination with gossip suggested an appetite for influence that might extend to darker deeds. Yet Miss Marple withheld judgment. True understanding required more than conjecture. She would continue to observe, patiently gathering information from subtle gestures, small omissions, and fleeting glances. Human nature, she reflected, was a delicate puzzle, and in Little Wimbrel, as elsewhere, even the smallest pieces could alter the picture entirely. As she settled by her window that evening, knitting quietly and watching the fading light over the village, Miss Marple understood that the first wave of suspicion was merely a prelude. Real clarity, she knew, came only when behavior, motive, and opportunity were examined with care, and she intended to do just that. The following morning, Little Wimbrel awoke to a sky streaked with pale pinks and greys, the faint promise of spring sunlight filtering through the clouds. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with a steaming cup of tea, allowed her thoughts to drift over the previous day's observations. The village, as always, had been busy forming theories, spreading rumors, and assigning blame. Yet none of these conjectures had drawn her attention as sharply as one particular, almost imperceptible detail. It was the detail she had noticed the previous afternoon. Near the base of the bell tower, a thread of deep violet caught on one of the lower stones. To any casual observer, it would have been meaningless, perhaps dismissed as a fragment of fabric from a passing visitor's attire. But Miss Marple had not dismissed it. The thread's delicate stitching, the subtle sheen of its material, and its unexpected color, all suggested something out of place, something deliberate. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and set out toward the tower, the thread still occupying her mind. She walked slowly, noting the dew on the grass and the subtle unevenness of the path. There was no hurry. Clues, she understood, often revealed themselves only when one approached the scene with patience. Reaching the bell tower, she crouched to examine the stone where the violet thread had been caught. Indeed, it remained, partially hidden in a crevice, yet its presence seemed more pronounced in the morning light. She touched it gently with a gloved finger, noting the direction in which it had frayed. It suggested movement, but not the careless kind one might expect from a stumble. This was deliberate. Something had brushed against the stone with intention. Miss Marple rose and surveyed the tower more broadly. Her eyes, sharp and unhurried, scanned the ground. The footprints she had noted previously remained faint but discernible. One set, leading toward the small garden gate, another skirting the base of the tower before disappearing among the flower beds. She considered each one carefully, weighing its significance. Something about the alignment of the paths, the subtle overlap of tracks, hinted at timing. Whoever had been present had moved with caution, avoiding contact with certain areas of the ground, as though rehearsing a route in advance. Her observations were interrupted by the soft approach of Mr. Edward Haythorne. He carried himself with his usual air of precise attentiveness, his gaze flicking toward the tower as though compelled by the events of the previous day. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope you are not inconveniencing yourself by wandering here." "Not at all, Mr. Haythorne," she replied gently. "One must understand the scene to grasp its peculiarities. A fall, while outwardly simple, may conceal subtleties that the eye seldom detects at first glance." He nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted it quietly, committing it to memory. Anxiety, she reflected, often revealed more than calm or indifference. As they spoke, a small, deliberate movement drew her attention to the edge of the flower bed. A solitary petal, violet in hue, had been disturbed from its position, lying slightly askew against the neatly trimmed grass. Its displacement was almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to echo the thread she had found earlier. Something, or someone, had brushed past this spot in a manner consistent with the frayed thread. Miss Marple's mind began to connect the seemingly trivial details, the color, the placement, and the slight disturbance of the natural order. She allowed Mr. Haythorne to speak a few more words before excusing herself. Her focus returned to the stonework of the tower, the base of the bell supports, and the adjacent path. Small impressions in the dirt suggested where someone's foot had landed carefully, almost ceremoniously. She recognized the signs of a practiced hand, precision in placement, subtle avoidance of contact with unstable stones, an awareness of surroundings that betrayed forethought rather than accident. Miss Marple knelt once more, examining the thread and its context with renewed attention. She could feel the quiet rhythm of causality beneath the scene. A step, a brush of fabric, a slight misdirection of balance. It was all so small, so subtle that it could easily be dismissed, and yet, to someone accustomed to observing human nature, these minute details spoke volumes. Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Havisham, the young schoolteacher. Miss Havisham's gaze immediately sought the tower, then shifted nervously toward Miss Marple. I thought I would check on Mrs. Davenport," she stammered, though her eyes lingered on the ground in an unusual manner. Miss Marple nodded, regarding her quietly. "It is wise to see that. She is comfortable. But tell me, Miss Havisham, have you noticed anything unusual near the tower yesterday?" Miss Havisham hesitated, adjusting her hands as if wringing them. "Well, no. I did not see much, really. It all happened so quickly. I only approached after everyone had gathered." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than polite conversation required. There was nothing overtly suspicious in the young teacher's words, yet the hesitation, the slight misalignment of eyes, the faltering in speech, suggested more than she admitted. It was precisely the sort of nuance that often unraveled a larger truth. She rose and began to walk slowly around the tower, noting the interplay of shadows, the faint patterns in the grass, and the carefully tended flower beds. Each small disturbance, each displaced petal, each stray thread offered a story. In the cumulative arrangement of these details lay the heart of the mystery, an almost invisible narrative that only a practiced observer could reconstruct. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting threads of color, footprints, and gestures. She understood that what appeared minor to others, the violet thread, the petal, the faint impressions in the soil, was anything but insignificant. The truth of the fall was written not in grand declarations, but in the subtleties of movement, intent, and behavior. As the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the garden, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. She had seen what others had overlooked. A hidden clue, subtle but telling, was now in her possession. The threads of truth were weaving themselves into coherence. The village may have been lost in gossip, but Miss Marple had found the first quiet evidence that would, in time, reveal far more than anyone suspected. By the middle of the week, little Wimbrel was gripped by a tension that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual village routines. Conversations, once casual and amiable, now bore the subtle undercurrent of suspicion. Doors closed slightly more deliberately. Glances were cast with caution, and even the children seemed aware that the ordinary rules of behavior had been altered. The incident at the bell tower, initially regarded by some as a tragic accident, had begun to reveal its layers as small fissures in human character became visible under Miss Marple's unflinching gaze. Miss Marple herself was undeterred by the atmosphere. She moved quietly through the village, attending to her ordinary errands, knitting at her usual pace, yet observing with precision. Her mind catalogued every expression, every hesitated word, every slight shift in posture that might reveal what the villagers preferred to conceal. She understood, as she always did, that it was often the small human reactions that held the key to the larger truth. Her first stop that morning was the Davenport residence. Mrs. Davenport, still weak but coherent, had begun to recount certain details to neighbors who visited out of polite concern. Yet, as Miss Marple listened, she detected a subtle inconsistency in the widow's account. It was not in what she said, it was in what she avoided saying. Certain names were omitted, certain times left vague, as though the recounting of events itself was being carefully managed. "Do you recall, Mrs. Davenport?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Who approached the bell tower just before your fall?" Mrs. Davenport's lips pressed together briefly. I don't remember seeing anyone in particular," she replied, her tone even. Yet the brief hesitation betrayed memory, or perhaps discomfort with the truth. Miss Marple made a note, aware that avoidance was sometimes as revealing as confession. Later that afternoon, she attended a small gathering at the home of Mrs. Penelope Sayers. The hostess had invited several villagers ostensibly to offer consolation, but the conversations quickly revealed the underlying tensions. Mrs. Sayers, with her habitual precision, had already begun organizing opinions, subtly directing the conversation toward those she deemed most suspicious. "Of course," Mrs. Sayers remarked, adjusting a delicate napkin, "accidents can happen to anyone, but one must ask oneself, who benefits from such an unfortunate event? It is not always what appears on the surface." Miss Marple, seated in a corner with a cup of tea, observed the reactions of those present. Mr. Haythorn's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Miss Havisham's hands rested tensely on her lap. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes flickered with interest. Even the postman, Mr. Finch, leaned slightly forward, as though eager to gauge each response. The subtle interplay of emotion, calculation, and social performance fascinated Miss Marple. The conversation soon turned to personal histories, as often happens when communities are shaken. Miss Marple listened as villagers revealed or unintentionally betrayed old grievances, rivalries, and minor scandals long buried. The school teacher, Miss Havisham, admitted to a disagreement with Mrs. Davenport regarding certain disciplinary practices. Though minor in itself, the dispute offered a glimpse of tension that, when viewed through the lens of motive, became more significant. Similarly, Mrs. Bellamy recounted a faintly embellished version of a social slight, a perceived insult years ago, that still seemed to resonate in her behavior. Miss Marple noted these details without comment. Human nature, she knew, often left traces of emotion that could later illuminate the path to truth. By evening, the subtle confrontations had multiplied. Villagers who had once exchanged polite words now offered pointed observations, insinuations disguised as casual remarks. Miss Marple, walking home along the familiar cobbled streets, catalogued the interactions with meticulous care. Each statement, each inflection, each hesitation added another layer to her understanding. In the quiet of her cottage, she reflected on what she had seen. The bell tower incident, outwardly a simple fall, was entwined with the private histories of those involved. Old rivalries, recent irritations, and the occasional hint of envy or jealousy had all come to light. Yet these revelations were scattered, and Miss Marple understood that a careful, discerning mind was required to assemble them into a coherent picture. She recalled, too, the subtle signs at the tower itself. The violet thread caught on the stone, the disturbed petal in the garden, the carefully placed footprints. Alone, each might appear trivial. Together, they formed a pattern suggestive of premeditation, or at the very least, deliberate presence. and when combined with the emerging social tensions, a picture began to form that demanded further attention. Miss Marple considered each suspect in turn, not as a police officer would, but with the quiet, relentless logic of observation. Mr. Haythorn's anxiety suggested either fear of implication or concealed knowledge. Miss Havisham's hesitation hinted at awareness of details she might not wish to reveal. Mrs. Sayers's fascination with influence and narrative suggested a desire to control perception. Even the seemingly inconsequential postman displayed behaviors that revealed subtle eagerness to assert innocence. It was not accusation, she reminded herself. It was discernment. In Little Wimbrel, as elsewhere, the truth was rarely shouted from rooftops. It resided in quiet gestures, in the timing of words, in the almost imperceptible friction between appearance and reality. The challenge was to observe without altering, to follow behavior without provoking deception. Late that evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Bellamy, usually composed, arrived at the door with an air of tentative urgency. She spoke in halting phrases, revealing a mixture of fear and excitement. I thought you should know," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There's something. Someone has been speaking in hushed tones about the night of the fall. Secrets. Things I never thought I'd hear." Miss Marple listened carefully, encouraging yet giving nothing away. She understood that in moments of heightened emotion, villagers often spoke more than they intended, revealing their own perceptions and, occasionally, truths hidden even from themselves. As the night deepened, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, knitting slowly, her mind weaving together threads of observation and insight. Confrontations and secrets, she knew, were only the surface of what lay beneath. Human nature was intricate, sometimes contradictory, but always revealing if one knew how to watch. In Little Wimbrel, the patterns were emerging, subtle and intertwined. Miss Marple sensed that with careful attention, the final pieces would soon align. The hidden motive, the delicate choreography of behavior, and the faintest traces of intent, all were leading her toward a revelation that would illuminate the entire village in all its quiet complexity. The next morning arrived with an air of quiet unease that seemed to ripple through Little Wimbrel. Villagers moved with a subdued pace, their conversations reduced to whispers, and even the morning sun appeared hesitant, casting long, uncertain shadows across the streets. Miss Marple, as usual, observed from her vantage point by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her mind was far from idle. The village, she reflected, was teetering on the edge of revelation, and she sensed that an unexpected development was imminent. Her suspicions were soon confirmed. A message arrived by hand, carried by the usually punctual postman, Mr. Finch. He delivered a small envelope, neatly sealed and bearing no indication of its sender. Miss Marple carefully opened it and found a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a hurried yet legible script. "Meet me at the edge of the orchard near the old yew tree at noon. There are things you do not yet know." Miss Marple considered the note calmly, though inwardly her curiosity was piqued. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet deliberate. Someone wished to convey information without attracting attention. It was a rare opportunity, she realized, to gain insight from someone with knowledge beyond the ordinary observations she had already gathered. By midday, she made her way to the orchard, taking care to move quietly along the familiar paths. The old yew tree stood near the boundary, its gnarled branches casting irregular shadows across the grass. A figure emerged from behind the tree, a man whose posture suggested both urgency and caution. Mr. Haythorn. "Miss Marple," he said quickly, glancing around as though ensuring no one observed them. I thought you should know that there is more to Mrs. Davenport's fall than anyone suspects." Miss Marple inclined her head, allowing him to continue without interruption. "Please, she said softly. Explain what you mean. Haythorn's voice dropped further, almost to a whisper. I overheard something last night. A conversation between Mrs. Sayers and the postman, Mr. Finch. They were speaking of the incident in ways that suggested knowledge. Not just of the fall itself, but of what led to it. I cannot be certain, but it seemed deliberate. Miss Marple absorbed his words, noting his unease. The revelation was subtle but significant. Two villagers, previously considered peripheral in terms of suspicion, might in fact be enmeshed in knowledge that went beyond casual observation. Yet she withheld judgment, as always, favoring observation over assumption. "Did they know you were nearby?" she asked quietly. Haythorn shook his head. "No. I was careful to remain unseen, but their conversation, it contained phrases, hints. I cannot repeat them precisely, but the implication was clear. Someone knew more than they let on." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It seems the web of secrecy is wider than we first imagined. Thank you, Mr. Haythorn. Your discretion is appreciated." He lingered a moment, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Oh, Miss Marple, do you think anyone will be harmed if this continues?" Miss Marple's gaze, calm and measured, met his. The truth has a way of revealing itself, often in small increments. When the time comes, it is seldom dangerous if one observes carefully. Haythorn hesitated, then departed, leaving Miss Marple alone beneath the twisted branches of the yew. She examined the shadows cast by the late morning sun, noting the subtle disturbances in the grass. Footprints that were barely visible, a slight indentation where someone had knelt, perhaps to retrieve or place an object. Her mind catalogued each detail, recognizing that these minor irregularities could carry significance if interpreted correctly. Returning to the village, Miss Marple noticed the subtle change in behavior among the residents. The postman moved with an unusual purpose, delivering letters more promptly than usual, his eyes flicking toward the bell tower as he passed. Mrs. Sayers appeared more vigilant than ever, arranging flowers in her garden with a precision that seemed almost obsessive, as though ensuring that everything remained in order and under her observation. Later that afternoon, a second revelation emerged. Miss Davenport, recovering slowly from her fall, confided to her nurse that she had received a note herself, unsigned, warning her to be cautious in her interactions with certain villagers. The nurse, flustered, shared this information discreetly with Miss Marple, who immediately understood its implications. There were multiple voices attempting to influence or manipulate perception, and the widow's awareness of hidden threats added a new dimension to the investigation. Miss Marple decided to walk once more to the bell tower, observing from the base of the structure. The afternoon sunlight illuminated details she had previously noted only in passing. The faint purple thread caught on the stone, the displaced petal among the flowers, and the subtle indentations in the soil where footprints had previously appeared. These physical traces, when combined with the social cues of whispered warnings and secretive notes, suggested a coordinated pattern, a chain of actions and reactions extending across multiple villages. Her mind turned to the implications. Someone was orchestrating perception, creating confusion, and attempting to conceal their role in the events that had unfolded. It was a rare, delicate manipulation, subtle enough to evade ordinary observation, yet present in ways that an attentive mind could discern. Miss Marple recognized that the threads of secrecy were intertwined with human behavior, not mere accident or coincidence. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She reflected on the day's developments, considering the broader picture. The incident at the bell tower was no longer a simple accident. It had become a nexus of hidden motives, subtle manipulations, and carefully veiled knowledge. The notes, the overheard conversation, and the minor disturbances around the tower were evidence of a carefully maintained deception, one that had yet to be fully understood. She poured herself a cup of tea, watching the long shadows stretch across the village. The mystery had deepened, but with each subtle clue, each whispered hint, the outlines of the truth began to emerge. Patience, observation, and quiet reasoning remained her tools, as always. In Little Wimbrel, she reflected, the most significant truths often lay hidden beneath layers of civility and routine, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Miss Marple's mind, alert and methodical, catalogued the patterns she had observed, recognizing that the true challenge was not simply in identifying wrongdoing, but in understanding the network of intentions and concealments. And as night settled over the village, she felt the faint stirrings of clarity amidst the growing web of deception, certain that the next steps would bring her closer to the ultimate revelation. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, a deceptively serene backdrop to the tension that continued to coil through Little Wimbrel. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a steaming cup of tea, reviewed the accumulating patterns of behavior she had observed in recent days. The village, outwardly composed, had become a subtle theater of deception, and she was prepared to conduct the final act, one in which the murderer might reveal themselves, not through overt confession but by their own reactions. She resolved to employ a method she had perfected over many years, the psychological test. A simple conversation, an apparently innocent remark, could prompt a revealing response. For this, she required the presence of the key villagers, those who had aroused suspicion through their subtle behaviors. Invitations were extended in the usual polite fashion, and by mid-afternoon, a small assembly had gathered at Miss Marple's cottage. Mr. Edward Haythorne, Miss Havisham, Mrs. Penelope Sayers, and even the usually reticent Mr. Finch were present, seated in a manner that suggested civility but betrayed a faint tension. Miss Marple, knitting calmly in her chair, addressed the room with her customary gentleness. "It is remarkable how much a single incident can reveal," she observed, her tone light and conversational. "Sometimes, even a fall, when viewed closely, shows us more about human nature than we might imagine." Her eyes swept across the group, noting each flicker of expression, each imperceptible shift in posture. She began subtly, discussing the incident at the bell tower in general terms. "I have often thought that accidents are seldom as simple as they appear," she mused aloud. "A stumble, a misplaced step, perhaps, or something more deliberate. I find that human behavior often leaves traces, even when intention is carefully concealed." Mr. Haythorne shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes narrowing. Miss Havisham's hands rested tensely in her lap, while Mrs. Sayers's lips pressed together, a faint frown appearing. Even the postman seemed momentarily uneasy, adjusting the collar of his coat. Each reaction, so slight as to be almost imperceptible, was catalogued by Miss Marple in her mind. She continued, weaving a story that was half observation and half imagined narrative. "Suppose," she said, her voice mild, "that someone wished to conceal their presence, to leave no trace of intent, yet small clues, threads, footprints, disturbances, might betray them. Would the observer, patient and attentive, not notice?" Haythorne glanced briefly at Miss Havisham, whose lips parted as if to speak, but no words emerged. Mrs. Sayers's frown deepened, and the postman's hand tightened around his teacup. Miss Marple allowed a few moments of silence to stretch, her eyes fixed on the group with the serene patience of someone knitting through decades of observation. Then she introduced a minor twist, an invented detail meant to provoke a reaction. "I have been considering," she said, "the possibility that a violet thread of delicate material might be caught on the stones at the base of the bell tower. A small, seemingly insignificant item, yet one that could hint at a person's presence. How interesting that such a trivial thing could reveal much about intention and timing." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Sayers's eyes widened for a brief moment, her fingers clutching her handkerchief tightly. Miss Havisham drew a shallow breath, glancing at Haythorne with a flicker of uncertainty. Haythorne himself remained outwardly calm, yet a slight tremor in his hand betrayed concealed emotion. Even the postman's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Miss Marple nodded subtly, acknowledging the reactions without comment. "Curious," she said softly. "Sometimes, even the most careful deception falters under the gentle pressure of observation. One might think a single detail, a thread, a petal, or a small disturbance, might escape notice. Yet human nature has a way of revealing itself." She allowed the moment to linger, then continued, steering the conversation gently towards social interactions on the day of the fall. "I've also been considering the movements of villagers, their conversations, and their interactions with the widow prior to her unfortunate accident. The way people speak, the hesitation in their voice, the quickness of a glance. These are the subtle signs that often betray intention." It was subtle, indirect, and entirely innocuous on the surface. Yet in the controlled environment of her sitting room, where every word and gesture could be observed, the true culprit began to betray themselves. Miss Marple noted, with quiet satisfaction, the almost imperceptible signs. A tightening of the lips, a quick, nervous glance, a slight stiffening of posture. She allowed her observations to continue without intrusion, knowing that patience was as vital as direct questioning. As the minutes passed, she introduced another small provocation. "It is fascinating," she said lightly, "how someone might leave a trail without realizing it. A thread, a footprint, a petal out of place. All can suggest much more than intended. The observer, if attentive, may deduce motives, timing, and presence." Mrs. Sayers's hand trembled slightly, and her gaze darted to the floor. Miss Havisham shifted, her eyes widening while the postman's breathing became noticeably faster. And then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, one figure displayed a reaction that set the pieces firmly into place. A faint, involuntary nod, the slightest tension of muscles that had otherwise remained composed. Miss Marple recognized it immediately. She allowed the tension to build, knitting steadily, waiting for the final confirmation. "It seems," she said at last, "that the human heart is rarely without signs, and even the smallest details, the thread, the petal, the footprint, can tell a story to those who know how to watch. Observation, patience, and understanding of human nature. These are often more revealing than the simplest evidence." The reaction she had anticipated, subtle and quiet though it was, sufficed. Miss Marple smiled gently, not for herself, but for the clarity of the truth now fully visible. The psychological test, carefully administered, had worked precisely as intended. The guilty party had betrayed themselves without a single direct accusation. The villagers, each momentarily uncertain, waited with polite restraint. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes sweeping the room. "I believe," she said quietly, "that our understanding of yesterday's events has reached a point where explanation is possible. The truth, as always, lies not in speculation, but in careful observation of both circumstance and human nature." And with that, she allowed the silent acknowledgement of her insight to settle over the room. The final stage of the test had revealed the true murderer, leaving Miss Marple with the knowledge that the culmination of patience, subtle provocation, and keen observation was nearly complete. Miss Marple rose from her chair, setting her knitting aside as she turned to face the small assembly gathered in her sitting room. The air was thick with anticipation, though the villagers did not yet understand why. Each held their own thoughts, their own theories, and for some, a quiet unease that made their limbs stiffen. Miss Marple's calm, measured presence contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, giving her an air of authority, rooted not in command, but in the quiet certainty of knowledge. "I believe," she began softly, that the events surrounding Mrs. Davenport's fall from the bell tower can now be understood in their entirety. It is, of course, a matter of human behavior rather than any mechanical failure or accident. The fall, tragic as it was, did not occur without intention, even if that intention was subtle and hidden beneath layers of civility. She allowed a brief pause, letting her words settle. Mr. Haythorne shifted in his chair, Miss Havisham's hands twitched slightly, and Mrs. Sayers's lips pressed into a thin line. Even Mr. Finch, the postman, appeared slightly apprehensive, though outwardly composed. Miss Marple's eyes, bright with quiet insight, swept over each of them. "The first clue," she continued, "was the thread of violet fabric caught on the stones at the base of the bell tower. A small, almost imperceptible detail, yet revealing in its consistency with other disturbances. The slight indentation in the soil, the displaced petal, and the footprints that suggest careful, deliberate movement. Such traces are rarely accidental, and in this instance, they indicated presence and intent." Mrs. Sayers's hand trembled faintly, betraying a tension she could not fully suppress. Miss Marple observed, with patient attention, how the slightest cue revealed hidden truths. "The second element," Miss Marple went on, "was the interplay of human behavior observed both before and after the incident. Hesitations, glances, subtle reactions, and whispered conversations all contributed to the tapestry of motive and opportunity. It is remarkable how often one can deduce intention from the smallest inconsistencies in speech and manner." Miss Marple allowed the room to absorb this. She spoke not to accuse, but to illustrate, leading them gently toward a realization that each individual could not yet articulate. "Mrs. Davenport's fall," she said finally, "was influenced, though not directly caused, by an orchestrated series of pressures and manipulations. The person responsible ensured that her attention would be diverted, her movements predictable, and her vulnerability heightened at precisely the moment of the accident. Her gaze, now steady and precise, rested on Mrs. Sayers. The subtle signs Miss Marple had observed during her psychological test, the tremor of her hand, the quick glance, the tightening of the lips, became crucial in placing motive, opportunity, and behavior into a coherent explanation. "The individual who orchestrated these events," Miss Marple continued, "did so not with overt violence, but with careful manipulation of circumstance. By influencing perception, by subtly altering the environment, and by creating distractions, they ensured that the outcome, though appearing accidental, would achieve the desired result." A faint gasp escaped Miss Havisham, who sat rigid, her eyes wide. Mr. Haythorne's face paled slightly, yet he remained silent, restrained. The postman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Marple, knitting needles poised, offered a calm smile. The evidence of human behavior is always revealing: the thread, the petal, the footprints. These are physical, but the truth is more often discovered in the subtle, almost imperceptible reactions of those involved. In this case, the culmination of observation and psychological response has allowed us to discern the individual responsible. Mrs. Sayers' lips parted as if to protest, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "Please, let us consider the motivations first. Mrs. Sayers, you have long sought influence within the village social circle. The incident at the bell tower presented an opportunity, perhaps unconsciously, to exert control and reinforce your position. Your behavior, both in private and in public, indicates awareness of events and an inclination to manipulate perception. The minute reactions observed during our discussion, subtle tremors, a quickened glance, the stiffening of posture, confirm what was already evident through circumstance." Mrs. Sayers's hand fell to her lap, the handkerchief she had clutched slipping to the floor. She spoke at last, her voice subdued. I did not mean—" "It was never my intention for anyone to be hurt." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Intent, as we have seen, can be subtle. One can orchestrate events in ways that avoid direct harm, yet still produce consequences. Your involvement lay in the manipulation of perception, the careful orchestration of circumstance, and the subtle diversion of Mrs. Davenport's attention." She turned then to the remaining villagers. "Mr. Haythorne, Miss Havisham, and Mr. Finch, your observations, interventions, and reports allowed the truth to emerge more quickly. While Mrs. Sayers's actions were concealed beneath civility, your honesty and attentiveness have been essential in clarifying the sequence of events." A silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint rustle of knitting. Mrs. Sayers lowered her gaze, acknowledging the insight Miss Marple offered without resistance. She understood at last that the truth had been revealed not through confrontation, but through observation, patience, and gentle deduction. Miss Marple continued softly, "In Little Wimbrel, the truth is seldom shouted. It resides in human behavior, in the patterns of movement, in the subtleties of speech and gesture. When one watches carefully, even the smallest inconsistencies can illuminate the broader picture. The village may return to normal, but the lesson remains. Human nature, with all its complexities, can rarely be hidden from a perceptive eye." Mrs. Davenport, seated quietly, nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I cannot thank you enough. You have uncovered what I could not understand, and in doing so have restored a sense of order to our village." Miss Marple smiled, gentle and unobtrusive. "We are all, at times, unaware of how our actions affect others. The important thing is to observe, to understand, and, when possible, to restore balance." And with that, the mystery of the bell tower, layered with subtle deceit, hidden motives, and almost imperceptible actions, was resolved. Miss Marple had guided the villagers to an understanding not through accusation, but through observation, patient reasoning, and a profound knowledge of human nature. The air, once thick with tension, seemed lighter. Yet the lesson of subtle human influence, of unspoken motives and concealed behaviors, lingered like a quiet whisper in the village streets. In Little Wimbrel, civility had been restored, but awareness had deepened, as it often does when truth is unveiled, not by force, but by the gentle, inexorable eye of the observer. The morning after, the revelation dawned with a quiet clarity, as though the village itself had breathed a sigh of relief. Little Wimbrel seemed almost unchanged in its outward appearance, cobbled streets gleaming faintly in the early sun, gardens neat and orderly, the distant chimes of the church bells punctuating the air. But beneath this familiar surface, a subtle shift had taken place. The village had endured a disruption, a momentary glimpse of human duplicity, and emerged tempered, alert, and forever more cautious. Miss Marple, as always, was the calm center of this new equilibrium. Seated in her favorite chair with her knitting basket at her side, she watched the early activity in the village through the open window. Children ran along the lane, oblivious to the previous week's events, while villagers greeted one another with polite smiles, though a few exchanged more measured glances than usual. Even in this ordinary scene, Miss Marple noted the faint traces of changed behavior, subtle acknowledgments of human fallibility and of lessons learned. Mrs. Davenport, recovering steadily from her fall, had been advised by the doctor to remain under light supervision, though she could already move more freely. She emerged into her garden that morning, tending to her roses with delicate care, a faint smile upon her lips. Miss Marple had called briefly to ensure her comfort, and the widow's gratitude was evident, not only in her words but in the relaxed posture that betrayed relief at the resolution of her ordeal. The villagers, for their part, approached Miss Marple with varying degrees of reserve and admiration. Mr. Haythorne offered a nod of quiet respect, acknowledging her subtle yet decisive intervention. Miss Havisham, still adjusting to the revelation of hidden motives, approached with cautious warmth, expressing her appreciation for Miss Marple's insight. Even Mr. Finch, the postman, displayed a newfound attentiveness, recognizing the value of careful observation and honesty in human dealings. The aftermath extended beyond mere gratitude. Conversations at the local tea rooms, the small market stalls, and along the village lanes were tinged with reflection. The incident at the bell tower had revealed not only hidden intentions, but also the delicacy of trust and perception. Villagers spoke in measured tones, carefully considering words before speaking, and a sense of communal awareness quietly emerged. Little Wimbrel, though returning to routine, was not the same village that had existed before the tragedy. Miss Marple, seated once more in her cottage, reflected upon the sequence of events. She considered the interplay of circumstance, behavior, and motive. The subtle manipulations, the whispered warnings, and the faint clues that had gone unnoticed by all but the most attentive observer. In every village, she knew, human nature was layered with complexity, envy, pride, ambition, fear, and the occasional kindness, all woven into a social tapestry that could conceal as much as it revealed. The case had demonstrated once again that the smallest details could carry extraordinary weight. The violet thread, the displaced petal, the indentation of a footprint. Each had been a key to understanding not just the physical sequence of events, but the intentions behind them. Miss Marple noted how often the truth is hidden, not in dramatic gestures, but in the ordinary, almost unnoticed actions of people who believe themselves unobserved. She thought, too, of Mrs. Sayers, whose motives had been subtle and indirect, yet powerful enough to orchestrate tension and concealment. The woman had not acted with overt malice, but with a careful manipulation of circumstance, demonstrating the potency of human cunning when intertwined with ego and social aspiration. Miss Marple, with her gentle understanding, had unraveled this thread not by accusation, but by patience, observation, and subtle prompting, a method far more enduring than any forceful approach. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a leisurely walk through the village. She noted familiar faces exchanging polite greetings, their expressions tinged with the quiet introspection born of recent events. The baker, Mr. Coates, smiled knowingly, aware that even routine kindness could conceal vigilance. Children, blissfully unaware, ran between the flower beds, their laughter light and carefree, reminding her that innocence, too, had its place in the intricate balance of human behavior. Arriving at the bell tower, she paused to survey the scene of the accident. The stones, the garden, and the steps were unchanged, yet the air felt different, less fraught, less charged with unspoken tensions. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Even in the quietest villages, she mused, the human heart holds secrets, and when those secrets collide with circumstance, the results may be unexpected, even tragic. Observation, understanding, and patience remain the most reliable guides to truth. Returning home, she settled by her window once more, knitting in the late afternoon light. She considered the lessons of the past week, the subtle manipulations, the faint signs, the intricate interplay of social standing and personal ambition. In Little Wimbrel, civility had been restored, yet awareness had deepened. The villagers would remember, perhaps unconsciously, the events at the bell tower, their own reactions, and the ways in which they observed one another. Miss Marple, for her part, did not dwell on victory or triumph. Her satisfaction was quiet, rooted in the understanding that truth, when approached with patience and care, would inevitably reveal itself. She smiled faintly, aware that human nature, complex, often contradictory, and endlessly fascinating, would continue to present mysteries for those willing to observe, to consider, and to reflect. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring rhythms of life in Little Wimbrel. The tension, the fear, the subtle deceit, all had passed, leaving in their wake a sense of restored balance. Yet she knew, as she often did, that human nature would always harbor quiet secrets, waiting for the perceptive eye to discern them. And so, in the evening hush, with the village gently resuming its ordinary rhythm, Miss Marple sat knitting, watching the light fade over the rooftops. The widow, the villagers, and even the postman had resumed their lives, touched by the subtle lessons of recent days. In little Wimbrel, as in all places where human hearts and minds intersect, civility endured. But beneath it, the truths of human nature remained, always observable to those who cared to notice. As twilight descended over little Wimbrel, the village settled into a quiet, reflective calm. Windows glowed softly in the fading light, and the distant chimes of the bell tower marked the passing of another day. Life, as always, continued. Gardens were tended, letters delivered, children laughed in the streets, but beneath the ordinary rhythms lay a subtle awareness of the week's revelations. The villagers moved with a new attentiveness, mindful of the hidden currents of human behavior, yet comforted by the restoration of civility and order. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting basket at her side, watched the village with her characteristic calm. She had guided events not through force, nor by accusation, but by patient observation, gentle questioning, and a keen understanding of the intricacies of human nature. In her quiet manner, she had illuminated truths that others had overlooked, revealing the delicate interplay of motive, opportunity, and behavior that had led to the incident at the bell tower. She reflected on the lessons hidden within the recent events. Human hearts were complex, layered with ambition, pride, fear, and kindness. Often, the smallest gestures, the tremor of a hand, a fleeting glance, a whispered word, spoke more loudly than words or evidence. It was in these subtleties, unnoticed by all but the attentive observer, that truth resided. The widow, Mrs. Davenport, had regained her strength and her sense of security. Other villagers, their suspicions and uncertainties gently resolved, continued their lives with newfound respect for both civility and vigilance. And Mrs. Sayers, whose subtle manipulations had been revealed, would remember the experience not with defiance, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the perceptive eye that had unraveled her intentions. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She knew the balance had been restored, yet she also understood that human nature would forever harbor secrets, deceptions, and unspoken desires. In every village, in every street, subtle truths awaited those who had the patience and discernment to observe. And in little Wimbrel, as in all places touched by ordinary lives and hidden motives, civility endured, but never without the quiet vigilance of those who truly understood the depths of human behavior. With the last light fading behind the rooftops, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the soft click of her needles a comforting accompaniment to the quiet evening. Outside, the village rested, its secrets acknowledged, its lessons learned, its harmony restored. And in that gentle twilight, Miss Marple, ever observant and quietly insightful, reflected once more on the intricate, endlessly fascinating nature of humanity.